Hello everyone and welcome back to another video on the channel. Today we are going to be talking about The Nun 2. This is the next film in the Conjuring universe, and quite frankly I should have started my 13 Days of Halloween series, last week when Slaughterhouse came out. I had a review out for that movie here on the channel because we're getting so many horror films in September. Apparently we had Slaughterhouse, now we have The Nun 2, and in a couple weeks we're going to have Saw X, so it's October already pretty much in my house. It's already horror season just beginning right now, and so let's just get into the Conjuring universe and how it's expanding even more. And there's a lot of implications in this film, how it ties into the total universe and how it ties into some characters from the original movies. And this is an interesting one. I didn't necessarily love this film, but I think there is a lot to talk about in The Nun 2. So this will be a spoiler review for everything that happens in this film. So if you've not seen The Nun 2 in theaters, I think it's an okay watch if you like, just very simple horror movies. Maybe a date night horror movie, this would be a good one. So if you saw the movie, let's just talk about all these spoilers in the film. So what is The Nun 2 about? Well, essentially it picks up after the events of the first film, where you have Sister Irene going on her career as being a nun. You also have the character of Maurice, who was also in that first film, returning here in this story. He also kind of went off on his own path. He has stopped over by this boarding school where he's met this school teacher and her young daughter named Sophie, and he's kind of gained a relationship in this rapport with these characters at this boarding school. But what he doesn't know is that in the last film, the nun attached itself to Maurice, and so he's kind of been a conduit to have all these different deaths happen on his journey from Romania all the way to where they are in this film. And to be quite honest, I honestly didn't remember much from the first Nun movie. I watched it once, I didn't really want to watch it because I heard not so great things about it, but when, me being the completionist I am, I wanted to watch all of the Conjuring Universe movies, and honestly, The Nun is very, very much down in the bottom of the barrel next to the first Annabelle movie. I did not really care for that movie too much. I never really wanted to rewatch it, and I don't remember much from it at all. Honestly, I didn't remember Maurice was in that film at all. I thought he was a new character that we were being introduced to until you found out that the nun attached itself to him, and I was like, oh yeah, he was in that movie, wasn't he? And so I was honestly in a complete blank state in terms of these characters in this film. And I think the biggest improvement on this film compared to the first one is I think the story structure and the characters are all improved here from that first film. Whereas I didn't enjoy these characters and that storyline, and the structure was kind of boring in that first movie. I thought the structure was pretty good here because, of course, you have Taissa figuring out that the nun is still, traveling on. She's trying to investigate exactly what is going on with all of these deaths and how it's leading all the way to this boarding school. And so you have this investigation with her along with Storm Reid, who's also a new addition in this film, who's another nun in this sort of church that they are going to investigate all the things in this film together. And in the meantime, this is also cutting between everything that's happening with Maurice at this boarding school, and it feels very reminiscent of the structure of those first two Conjuring movies, where you have the family off on the side that's dealing with the actual hauntings. They're dealing with a demon. They're slowly figuring out, they don't exactly know what's happening. They're all experiencing these paranormal events all in separate occasions before they come together to figure out exactly what's going on. In the meantime, you have the Warren characters that were in the Conjuring movies, or in this case, you have Taissa character and Storm Reid's character investigating the same case, and they come together at the third act of this movie, and they figure out how to solve this problem together by the ending of it. So the structure was, entertaining in this film, and I did enjoy the characters and how Storm Reid and how Taissa characters really bonded throughout this movie, where Storm Reid is a type of character where she wasn't necessarily wanting to be a nun. She went there because, her mother died in an incident involving a fire, so her father decided to send her off onto a religious path. She's really, finding her footing in the church, in her, religion. She's trying to figure out exactly what her faith is. And so, there is a nice little parallel between what Taissa character went through in the first film, along with what Storm Reid's character is going through in this film. So I think the pairing worked pretty well. I think the chemistry between these actresses were pretty good. I don't think that the meets between these characters was as good as I want it to be. And when I get to the third act, I think they really did waste Storm Reid's potential and her talents, because she is a very, very talented actress. And I wish she had more of a role in this final act that was a little more, meaty and interesting to see, but, what we got is what we got. And I really liked Maurice's dynamic with Sophie in this movie. I thought they had a really great and cute relationship throughout this entire film as, a sort of father figure to her, because she doesn't have a father, and this, growing romance between him and her mother was also a good one to see. I love the dance scene in this movie at pretty much the midway point before everything goes to hell. I really liked all that stuff, and every time he kind of was off on his own and he started twitching out and the nun started wreaking havoc to the people around them. Those sequences of horror were actually pretty good. I really liked, well, the opening scene was interesting to me because I thought it started off pretty strong, and then the priest just kind of lit on fire in a kind of goofy way, which that kind of got me worried for the scare sequences in this movie because it was very sudden, very snappy, and very brutal, but also kind of came across as a little bit funny. Whereas there was another sequence where this girl, delivering mail goes up to Maurice's place, knocks on the door, she goes inside, and he's twitching off in the corner, and you get to see the nun come out and absolutely brutally kill her in this entire sequence, which was a very shocking moment, and that was effective. Whereas the fire one came across as funny, this one came off as genuinely scary. And when it comes to my favorite scare sequence in this movie, it was also in the second act of this movie when Taissa is getting closer to figuring out where the nun is, and she goes over to this newsstand out in the middle of the street, and the pages start flipping all together. You see this in the trailer, and it forms the shape of the nun, and it pops out, and it's such a great scare sequence. I really loved the tension and the suspense built in all three of those. For the most part, I think that Michael Chaves does a decent job directing these Conjuring movies. I don't think he's nearly as talented as James Wan in how he handles the horror sequences, because I think he does struggle with the horror sequences turning into action sequences, which I think some horror movies really do struggle with this for some reason. There's a big difference between building suspense in a horror movie and building tension in a scare sequence versus building up a set piece with the intensity and the action that then falls upon the characters when that sort of sequence plays out. And that is what a lot of these scare sequences in this movie feels like, which is pretty disappointing, especially when it came to the third act. If everything was kind of scaled down a bit, which we'll get into exactly how I think that could have improved this third act, I think this movie would have been much better and would have landed much better for me as an audience member, because I'm not going in to watch an action movie. I'm watching, a horror movie. I want to be scared. I want that suspense. I want that tension to be built up in a very satisfying way with these characters that I don't want to be harmed. And I never really felt that in this movie too much. Honestly, this movie kind of felt like an Indiana Jones type movie. And when it comes to the lore of the nun, I thought this movie did a lot to explore the lore of this character and how the nun came to be, and how Sister Irene and Lorraine Warren felt personally tied to the nun's character. Because in Conjuring 2, it felt like it was a personal attack between the nun and Lorraine Warren. It felt like there's some history behind these characters that goes deeply rooted in their past, and that's exactly what you find out in this movie, which kind of recontextualizes The Conjuring 2, because this family line is related to St. Lucy, who created this artifact who can't be burned, and is all tied into the history of the nun. And I found all that stuff fairly interesting. And so what you get in this film is some interesting ties into what it means to the greater Conjuring universe, I guess. You get some lore and some history with this nun character that makes the nun a lot more interesting, that recontextualizes Conjuring 2. You have some characters in this film that are more interesting in this movie than they were in the first Nun movie, and you have some decent scare sequences. But then we get into the third act of the film, where you finally have all the characters finally come together in the third act of this film to, do the final confrontation with the nun itself, and then it just turns into a giant action set piece. Like I said, if you scaled this movie down with everything that happens in this third act, I think it would have been greatly improved. I don't think you need this little goat creature devil monster chasing around all the boarding school girls along with Storm Reid through the hallways of this boarding school. You don't need any of that. It felt like, the direction in this, I guess, action sequence was pretty good. I do think it was thrilling. I do think it was extremely well made and put together, and I think that the design of this, goat devil creature was decent enough, and I think there was some thrill in that. But I don't care about any of these boarding school girls, and I don't really care too much about Storm Reid, because you haven't given me too much meat for her character to be tied with these random boarding school characters. She's never met them for a day in her entire life, and so yes, there's some selflessness in trying to help these characters, but these characters were bullies to Sophie throughout the entire movie. They're terrible people. You even have the bully character get stabbed at one point by this goat thing, and that never really comes up again. She just kind of runs away, and then the movie ends after that point. And so there's so many things with Sophie going off with these characters that I just did not care about. Then you have Sister Irene with Maurice, who's being fully turned into this conduit for the nun that is chasing after Sophie for this artifact that is going on throughout this tower with this bell at the top of it, and the bell crashes down, and Sophie and Maurice end up on this platform that's crumbling down and falling off. Like I said, very Indiana Jones, like they're all going after this little artifact, and they're going to use it in order to fight off against the demon. And I don't need any of that. And what makes these characters, or could have made these characters interesting in this third act, is a moment where Sophie can beg to Maurice's character to not harm her, because there is that connection. There is a moment where Maurice could try to fight through this possession to try to have a more personal and emotional connection in terms of what these characters mean to each other, but instead you get them chasing each other up this bell tower that all comes crumbling down, and it's very flashy. And then you get a sequence where Taissa Farmiga's character is in this room that's covered in wine. Now there's wine splashing everywhere. You have the nun rise up out of the wine, which is a great shot. The cinematography in this movie is very effective in terms of how it is presented on screen, but I didn't really care of all this stuff splashing on the screen, all these characters screaming and yelling, when I wanted something more personal, something more character based with these moments. And there was one moment where Storm Reid finally goes back to the plot, and she goes back to Taissa Farmiga, and they decide to pray together at the peak of the nun's insanity, and all this wine splashing around, and everything goes quiet, and you just hear their prayers. And I'm like, finally you have a character moment where Storm Reid is reaching the end of her character arc, but it just feels a little bit too late at this point, because she was just running off across this little goat monster thing just a second ago. And so I think this movie has a bit of an identity crisis. It wants to be a more interesting story with character and with the mythology of the nun and tying all these things together, but then it wants to also be a really high octane, bigger and better sequel to the first one. You're expanding the Conjuring universe in the biggest film yet, when I wanted this movie to be a little more down to earth, a little more personal, like those first two Conjuring movies were. And whenever you have a Conjuring spinoff without the Warrens, you just feel a gaping hole. The heart of the franchise just isn't there. And although Taissa Farmiga and all the performances in this movie are really strong, I just don't think that these actors are given the material to work with to make them truly special. And so this movie almost had me for the first two acts, and it almost completely lost me by the ending of it. But that being said, like I said at the beginning of the review, I think this is a perfectly fine horror movie. I don't think it's bad. I think it works for a date night horror movie. You just want some thrills and some jumps. I watched it in Dolby, and I think the sound design was really good. And like I said, the cinematography is pretty effective throughout the entire movie. And as an action set piece for the ending of the film, I do think that Michael Chaves does a great job directing that. But me as a horror fan wanted a horror movie. And so how does the film resolve? Well, of course, you have the moment where Maurice is about to stab Sophie, and he tries to fight back. Like I said, they were screaming instead of a personal moment, but that beat was still there in this movie, and he's able to hold back. Then Taissa Farmiga and Storm Reid, they pray, and the nun, gets blasted by all this wine, and they all just kind of walk away happily ever after. And you don't really know exactly what happened to the nun at this point. It was teased in the first Nun movie that it was attached to Maurice at that point, so you know exactly where this nun is going to go off to continue on, where you don't get that in this film. They just kind of have their happy ending. They grow some tomatoes, and they all walk off into the sunsets, I guess metaphorically. There's no real sunsets, but it is a very, very happy ending. And then you get a post-credit sequence where you get to see Lorraine Warren and Ed Warren in this post-credit. You get a little tease that these characters are going to come back in some sort of capacity. And honestly, I deleted Twitter ever since it became X, so I am kind of out of the loop in terms of the movie news circuit, but I haven't heard of them making a Conjuring 4 just yet. Or if they're, I always thought it would be a great idea to make a Conjuring TV series that follows Ed and Lorraine Warrens and their kind of, smaller cases throughout their life that, have all these either demonic possessions, or like Conjuring 3 had more of like a totem type thing, like some witchcraft. So whatever the cases are going to be, I want to see Ed and Lorraine Warren work on more things like that. And so there's a tease of them coming back in some sort of capacity. I hope it's a series where they're, kind of like a villain of the week type of thing with an overall arcing story. Maybe tie the nun into that. And you can even have fun and have Vera Farmiga and Taissa Farmiga somehow meet on screen together with these visions of how the past connects with the present with the nun. I don't know if they're going to make a Nun 3 in some sort of way, but, I think you can tie these stories together in some sort of way that can be interesting in the future. And like I said, I think the lore presented in this movie, recontextualizing that personal attack that the nun has against Vera Farmiga's character in The Conjuring 2, does recontextualize it in a positive manner for a prequel. And so it's a very mixed bag for me on this movie. I'm very curious to hear all your thoughts on this film. Did you guys like it? Did you guys not like it? Do you think this was an improvement over the first one? I do think it is a clear improvement, although I don't think it is as great as, horror movies have been in recent memory. It's nothing as good as something like Talk to Me or Evil Dead Rise. This is just kind of an okay horror movie, an okay installation in the Conjuring universe that's, feels like this universe is losing some steam. But if we get back to Ed and Lorraine Warren, I am a fan of this franchise, and I hope that it can thrive in some sort of fashion with those characters later down the line. But that'll be my review for The Nun Nun 2. I'm very curious to hear all your thoughts in the comment section down below. Do you guys like the movie more than the first one? Do you guys hate this movie? Do you guys still think that the Conjuring universe is on a decline, or do you think this was just an okay installation? Are you excited for the possible future implications that this movie has onto the further Conjuring universe? I'm very curious to hear all your thoughts in the comment section down below. And if you enjoyed this review, make sure you guys subscribe to the channel to see more reviews just like this. Like I said, I have Slaughterhouse here on the channel. You can see all the details in that movie and how ridiculous that was, along with Saw X later on this month, which will probably kick off my 13 Days of Halloween series this year. So if you want to see more horror reviews, I will definitely have all that here on the channel, along with Ahsoka. I've been reviewing Ahsoka week by week, so a lot of stuff on the channel for you guys to watch and enjoy. So thanks guys for watching this video, and I hope to see you all in my next one.